There's a strange power that comes from silence, not the passive-aggressive kind, not the sulking kind, but the silence of someone who has finally seen through the game and no longer needs to play it. When a deeply feeling, deeply giving person, the kind of person I call a super empath, reaches that moment of clarity, everything changes. Because up until that point, the avoidant always thought they had the upper hand. They believed that by pulling away, withholding, keeping things uncertain, they were the ones in control. But the truth is, the most devastating blow to the avoidant ego is not a fight, not a pleading message, not a grand speech. It's the sudden absence of reaction. It's the silence that says, "You no longer have the power to disturb my peace." And here's why it works. When the empath stops chasing, the avoidant is confronted with a terrifying truth that their push and pull no longer hooks you, that the validation they fed on has disappeared, and suddenly their strategies collapse in on themselves. It's not about revenge, it's about liberation, because silence isn't punishment. It's the moment the empath finally puts their energy back where it belongs, into themselves. That silence speaks louder than any words ever could. Silence is often misunderstood. People sometimes think silence means weakness, avoidance, or surrender. But in reality, silence, when chosen intentionally, is one of the strongest forms of communication. It carries a weight that words can't always deliver, because words can be debated, twisted, explained away, or ignored. Silence, on the other hand, leaves no defense, no foothold, and no reassurance. It forces the other person to sit with themselves and the emptiness they have created. This is why silence becomes a super empath's greatest strength when dealing with an avoidant personality. The avoidant is used to controlling the rhythm of the relationship. They push away when it gets too close, and they expect the other person to reach out, to chase, to repair, and to reassure. This constant push and pull dynamic is what fuels their ego and maintains their illusion of control. They rely on reaction. They rely on the fact that the empath cares too much to simply walk away without trying to fix it. But when the empath finally stops playing into that cycle and instead chooses silence, everything shifts. Suddenly, the avoidant's usual tactics don't land the same way. The cold distance they once used to intimidate now mirrors back at them in a way that feels unsettling. They no longer have the power they once believed they did. For the empath, silence is not about punishment. It is not about creating confusion or trying to manipulate in return. Instead, it is about stepping into power by refusing to pour energy into someone who only feeds on it without giving anything back. Silence says, "I will no longer explain myself to someone who doesn't want to listen. I will no longer beg for the bare minimum. I will no longer validate your behavior with my attention." It is not passive, it is deeply active, because it is a conscious decision to withhold something that was once freely given. The beauty of silence lies in what it reveals. To the avoidant, it reveals the absence of control, the absence of their usual ego boost. They start to notice the void, and the silence begins to echo louder than words ever could. To the empath, it reveals strength they didn't know they had. It reveals that they can stand tall without explaining, without chasing, without giving in to their own fear of abandonment. It proves that they don't need to keep proving their worth to someone who refuses to see it. And in this moment, silence becomes power not because it destroys the other person, but because it builds the empath. It is power because it stops the endless cycle of emotional chasing. It is power because it creates space for peace, clarity, and healing. Silence becomes the loudest declaration of self-respect, and ironically, the one message the avoidant cannot ignore. There is a moment in every empath's journey where the fog begins to lift, and they finally see the patterns for what they are. For so long, the avoidant's behavior can feel confusing, almost hypnotic. One day, the avoidant shows warmth and affection, and the next, they retreat into distance and coldness. This inconsistency keeps the empath hooked, trying to figure out what went wrong, replaying every conversation, analyzing every silence. The empath's natural instinct is to fix, to heal, to understand, and so they keep investing energy into someone who thrives on withholding. But once the empath sees through the game, everything changes. Recognition is the turning point. It is the moment the empath realizes that the avoidant's behavior isn't about them, their worth, or their actions. Instead, it is about the avoidant's inability to face intimacy without fear. The avoidant pushes away not because the empath is lacking, but because closeness exposes their own insecurities. For the empath, this shift in perspective is liberating. What once felt like a personal rejection begins to look like a repeated pattern that has little to do with love and everything to do with avoidance. Seeing through the game breaks the emotional spell. Before, the avoidance retreat would trigger panic and self-doubt in the empath, pulling them deeper into the cycle of trying to prove themselves. But with clarity, the empath no longer feels compelled to chase. They start to recognize that chasing only reinforces the avoidance behavior. By refusing to participate, they reclaim their energy and dignity. Suddenly, what used to feel like a devastating loss now feels like an opportunity to step away from manipulation. This awareness also strips the avoidant of their silent advantage. Their strength has always come from the empath's confusion, from the emotional hooks that keep the empath tethered. When the empath finally understands the mechanics of the push and pull, those hooks lose their grip. The avoidant's cold withdrawal, once powerful, now looks predictable. Their mixed signals, once confusing, now seem like a script that has been played out countless times before. What was once mystifying now becomes almost boring in its familiarity. For the empath, this realization is not about revenge or judgment, but about clarity. It is the quiet knowing that they deserve consistency, safety, and love that doesn't come with conditions or games. When the empath sees through the avoidance tactics, they no longer feel the urge to fight for scraps of affection. They no longer confuse unpredictability with passion. And this change in vision is what robs the avoidant of their control, because the game only works when the other player doesn't know the rules. Once the empath sees the rules, they have the power to stop playing. Absence has a way of speaking louder than words ever could. For someone who is avoidant, distance has always been their tool of control. They withdraw to create uncertainty. They step back to make the other person reach forward, and they thrive on the emotional chase that follows. But when the super empath finally stops responding, when they no longer call, text, or try to close the gap, the absence becomes a message the avoidant cannot ignore. It is not the kind of absence that comes from indifference at first, but the kind that grows from deep clarity. And once it takes root, it delivers the most devastating impact, not through anger or confrontation, but through silence that leaves no reassurance, no validation, and no echo. The avoidant relies on reaction to feed their ego. Every unanswered message that eventually gets a reply, every cold silence that ends in an apology, every withdrawal that is met with pursuit, all of these reinforce their belief that they hold power in the dynamic. Their identity within the relationship often rests on this pattern. But when the empath no longer plays their part, when the absence is no longer followed by chasing or soothing, the avoidant faces a void they cannot fill. Their ego, which once fed on control, begins to starve. The absence highlights their own isolation, not the empath's weakness. The irony is that the avoidant often fears abandonment while simultaneously creating it through their own behavior. They pull away to protect themselves from closeness, yet what they fear most, being left behind, becomes real when the empath finally grows silent. The empath's absence strips away the illusion that someone will always be there no matter how much they push them away. This realization shakes the avoidant at their core, because it is no longer about a conflict that can be smoothed over with a breadcrumb of affection. It is about the sudden collapse of the cycle that once made them feel powerful. For the empath, absence becomes an act of strength. Instead of sending long explanations, pleading for change, or proving their loyalty yet again, they choose not to respond. That choice is louder than any speech they could give. It says, "I see the game and I no longer wish to participate." It removes the avoidance leverage, because silence is not something that can be debated or manipulated. The avoidant can no longer bait them into arguments or emotional displays. They are left with nothing to hold on to but the weight of their own actions. This is why absence is the most devastating message. It does not announce itself with drama, nor does it seek revenge. It is simply the quiet removal of energy that once sustained the dynamic. To the avoidant, it feels like the rug has been pulled from under them, because for the first time, their withdrawal no longer draws the empath in closer. Instead, it pushes the empath out completely, leaving the avoidant alone with the silence they created but can no longer control. Silence, when chosen by the empath, is often mistaken as an act of revenge. From the outside, it may look like punishment or a cold strategy to make the avoidant feel the same pain they once caused, but that is not what it truly is. Silence, in its purest form, is not about teaching the avoidant a lesson. It is about finally recognizing that the constant giving, explaining, and overextending have drained the empath of their peace, and the only way to restore it is to stop pouring energy into someone who refuses to receive it with care. Silence is not the sound of cruelty, it is the sound of freedom. For the empath, choosing silence is a turning point. It marks the moment they realize they do not need to fight to prove their worth. They no longer have to keep demonstrating loyalty or love in order to be seen. Silence says, I do not need to make noise to exist. I do not need to chase to matter. I can rest in my own presence without needing your validation. This shift is monumental because it takes back power from the avoidance push and pull dynamic. Instead of reacting, the empath reclaims control simply by withdrawing their energy and attention. The avoidant may interpret this silence as rejection or punishment, but in truth, it is the opposite. Silence is an act of self-preservation. It is a refusal to keep engaging in cycles that leave the empath depleted. By stepping back, the empath is not seeking to harm the avoidant, they are seeking to heal themselves. That distinction is what makes silence powerful rather than destructive. It is not driven by bitterness. It is fueled by clarity. What the avoidant experiences as ice-cold silence is actually warmth redirected inward. The empath, who has spent so much time giving love outward, finally begins to give it back to themselves. They invest in their own peace, their own growth, their own sense of worth. Silence becomes the shield that protects them from slipping back into old patterns of over-explaining and over-giving. It frees them from the exhausting role of being both caretaker and pursuer in a dynamic that was never balanced. The beauty of this silence lies in its finality. It requires no explanation, no dramatic exit, no grand confrontation. It simply exists as a boundary that cannot be crossed. In this way, silence liberates the empath from cycles of pain and reminds them that their energy is sacred. It is not a weapon, it is a sanctuary. And while the avoidant may struggle to understand it, the empath knows deep down that this kind of silence is not about revenge. It is about finally choosing themselves. When the empath finally stops pouring energy into someone who cannot receive it with care, there is a natural redirection that takes place. For so long, their love, attention, and validation have been focused outward, often toward a partner who thrives on creating distance. This outward focus leaves the empath drained, always striving to prove their worth, always hoping their consistency will eventually melt the avoidance walls. But when they choose silence, when they withhold their energy, something powerful happens. All that love begins to flow back inward. Instead of being lost in a cycle of chasing and fixing, it becomes fuel for their own healing, growth, and strength. This redirection of energy is not immediate. It often comes after pain, clarity, and the realization that giving endlessly to someone who resists intimacy only creates exhaustion. Yet, once the empath makes that shift, the transformation is undeniable. The validation they once sought from the avoidant is replaced with self-validation. They no longer need to hear that they are enough, because they finally start to feel it within themselves. Their silence becomes an act of self-love, a declaration that they will no longer invest in what diminishes them. For the avoidant, this shift is deeply unsettling. They have been accustomed to being the center of the empath's energy. Each retreat, each mixed signal, each withdrawal was met with pursuit. But when the empath stops responding, that cycle collapses. The avoidant is left facing a mirror they cannot escape, one where their usual tactics no longer produce attention or reassurance. What they once relied on, the empath's endless supply of validation, is gone. In its place, there is nothing but silence. The absence of energy creates discomfort, not because the empath has become cruel, but because the avoidant has lost their primary source of affirmation. Meanwhile, the empath begins to experience the freedom that comes with redirecting their energy. They discover how much lighter life feels when they are no longer constantly analyzing someone else's moods or adjusting themselves to keep the peace. They find joy in pouring their effort into passions, friendships, self-care, and personal growth. The energy that once fueled a draining dynamic now becomes the foundation of empowerment. It is not just about surviving the loss of the avoidant's attention. It is about thriving without needing it at all. This redirection also creates a powerful shift in identity for the empath. They are no longer the person who bends, pleads, or overcompensates to keep love alive. They become someone who knows their value and protects it. Their silence is not a void, but a space filled with self-respect. the more they redirect their love back into themselves, the stronger they become, and the less appealing the old cycle appears. The silence is not empty, it is full of reclaimed energy, peace, and strength, and that is what makes it so powerful, not because it destroys the avoidant, but because it rebuilds the empath. And so, what begins as silence, the kind that feels cold, final, and almost unbearable, becomes something far more powerful. It becomes the moment the empath steps into their strength. It becomes the boundary that says, I choose peace over chaos. I choose clarity over confusion. I choose myself over games. The avoidant may feel the sting of that absence, but the deeper truth is this: the silence was never about destroying them. It was about releasing the empath from a cycle that stole too much of their energy and offering that energy back to where it belonged all along, within. That is the lesson of the super empath's silence. It is not cruelty. It is not revenge. It is freedom. It is healing. It is the reclaiming of dignity and self-worth. And in the end, silence says the one thing words never could: I am no longer available for anything less than real love. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing this space. And thank you for choosing to rise above the noise. Remember, your silence speaks volumes. Protect it, honor it, and let it lead you back to yourself. Goodbye, and thank you.